There are places on this planet where the water pressure is so extreme that it would crush a military submarine as if it were an empty can. Places where the darkness is absolute, where the temperature hovers near the freezing point, and where for centuries it was believed that it was impossible for life of any kind to exist. Ocean trenches are the deepest and least explored regions of the Earth, and for decades they remained beyond the reach of any human technology. Everything changed when engineers began building vehicles capable of withstanding pressures of more than 1,000 atmospheres, and what those robots found when they descended to the most extreme depths of the planet not only surprised scientists. It completely redefined our understanding of the limits of life and of terrestrial geology. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Let's begin. The Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific is the deepest point of all the oceans. Its deepest part, the Challenger Deep, is found at approximately 10,935 meters below the surface, a figure that is difficult to visualize. For reference, if Mount Everest were placed at the bottom of that trench, its summit would be more than 2 kilometers underwater. The trench has a length of about 2,550 kilometers and a width of barely 69 kilometers, with an elongated and narrow shape that results from the process of subduction of the Pacific Plate beneath the Mariana Plate, a process that occurs at a rate of between 2 and 3 centimeters per year and generates one of the zones of greatest seismic and volcanic submarine activity in the world. The first time human beings reached the Challenger Deep was on the 23rd of January of 1960, when Swiss oceanographer Jacques Piccard and United States Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh descended aboard the bathyscaphe Trieste, a vehicle designed by Piccard's father, Auguste Piccard. The descent took nearly 5 hours and the ascent another 3 hours and 20 minutes. What Piccard and Walsh saw at the bottom was, in their own words according to the expedition records, a plain of soft sediment with what appeared to be flatfish, possibly flounders, moving along the bottom. That finding, which was later questioned by some scientists who doubted that bony fish could survive those pressures, was the first indication that life in ocean trenches was not only possible but real. For decades after the descent of the Trieste, the trenches remained practically unexplored. The cost and technological difficulty of building vehicles capable of withstanding those pressures was enormous. The situation changed radically in 2012, when film director James Cameron descended to the Challenger Deep aboard the Deep Sea Challenger, an innovatively designed vertical submersible that took 2.5 hours to reach the bottom. Cameron spent 3 hours at the deepest point of the ocean, collecting sediment samples and recording video in high definition. The sediment samples he brought to the surface contained living organisms, including foraminifera, single-celled organisms with shells, and organic remains of surface origin that had reached the bottom through sedimentation, which confirmed that the Challenger Deep was not a biological desert, but an active ecosystem. But the greatest advance in the exploration of ocean trenches came with the 5 Deeps expedition, completed between 2018 and 2019, in which explorer and financier Victor Vescovo descended to the 5 deepest points of the 5 oceans aboard the submersible DSV limiting factor built by the company Triton Submarines. The limiting factor was designed specifically to carry out repeated and safe descents to the greatest oceanic depths, something that no previous vehicle had been able to do systematically. Vescovo descended to the Challenger Deep on the 28th of April of 2019 and reached a depth of 10,928 meters, which at that time was recorded as the greatest depth reached by a human being. What Vescovo and the scientific team accompanying him on the support vessel found during those descents was, in several cases, completely unexpected. At the Challenger Deep, the cameras of the limiting factor captured organisms that the team's biologists could not identify immediately. Among them were amphipod crustaceans, resembling shrimp, but adapted to live under extreme pressures, of a species that turned out to be new to science. Also observed were sea cucumbers of up to 30 centimeters in length moving slowly across the sediment, fish of the family Leporidae, the so-called snailfish, which researchers identified as the species of bony fish living at the greatest depth ever documented. The snailfish of the ocean trenches are one of the most fascinating findings of deep marine biology. In 2023, a team of researchers from the University of Western Australia and the Tokyo Oceanographic Institute filmed for the first time in the Japan Trench a snailfish of the species Pseudoleparus belliaevi at a depth of 8,336 meters, the greatest depth at which a fish had ever been filmed. The images, obtained with autonomous bottom cameras, showed the animals swimming with apparent ease in the absolute darkness, feeding on the amphipods that also abound at those depths. The adaptation of these fish to such extreme pressures is made possible by the presence in their tissues of trimethylamine N-oxide, or TMAO, a molecule that stabilizes cellular proteins under pressure and whose concentration in fish tissues increases with the depth at which they live. But organisms are not the only surprising thing that robots have found in the trenches. Geochemical analyses of sediment samples collected in the Challenger Deep during the 5 Deeps expedition and in subsequent expeditions from the Schmidt Ocean Institute revealed the presence of microplastics in significant concentrations, including synthetic clothing fibers and fragments of plastic packaging. The finding was published in 2020 in the journal Nature Geoscience and caused considerable impact because it demonstrated that human plastic contamination has penetrated even to the most remote and inaccessible point on the planet. Researchers also found elevated concentrations of persistent organic pollutants, such as PCBs and PBDEs, industrial compounds that were banned in many countries decades ago but continue to circulate in the oceans and accumulate in the food chains of the trenches. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. The Puerto Rico Trench in the Atlantic is the deepest of that ocean, with a maximum of 8,376 meters at the point known as Milwaukee Deep. The descents carried out with ROVs by NOAA and the University of Rhode Island in the last decade have revealed an unexpected biodiversity at those depths, with species of conidarians, echinoderms, polychaetes, and crustaceans that in many cases had not been previously documented in the Atlantic. The Puerto Rico Trench is also geologically significant because it is a zone of high seismicity. The earthquake that generated the Caribbean tsunami in 1918 originated in its vicinity, and current risk models for the Caribbean consider the Puerto Rico Trench as a potential source of earthquakes of magnitude greater than 8. In the Indian Ocean, the Java Trench, also known as the Sunda Trench, reaches 7,290 meters depth and is the deepest of that ocean. The sonar high-resolution scans carried out by the German research vessel SON and by vessels of the Australian CSIRO in the last decade have revealed that the bottom of the trench is not a uniform plain, but a landscape of mounds, channels, and sedimentary deposits of great complexity. In 2022, a Schmidt Ocean Institute expedition carried out the first high-resolution mapping of a 1,500-kilometer stretch of the trench using the ROV Sebastian and documented fields of mineral concretions similar to those of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, but with a different composition, richer in barium and strontium. One of the most surprising aspects of descents to ocean trenches is what they reveal about the active geology of the seafloor. In the Mariana Trench, the seismic sensors installed by the 5 Deeps expedition team recorded continuous microtremors, shakes of magnitude less than 2, that occurred dozens of times per day as a result of the subduction process. The models generated from that data confirm that the Pacific Plate does not sink smoothly and continuously but in a series of discrete jumps, each of which releases a small amount of seismic energy. This process of subduction by discrete jumps is the same that, when it occurs in larger segments and with greater energy accumulation, produces megathrust earthquakes, the most powerful that exist, such as the Tohoku earthquake in Japan in 2011 of magnitude 9.1, which generated the devastating tsunami that caused the Fukushima nuclear accident. The fluids that emerge from the bottom of ocean trenches during the subduction process are another object of intensive study. When the oceanic plate sinks beneath the continental plate, the water that permeates the sediments and the oceanic crust is squeezed upward by the pressure, creating filtrations of cold fluids known as cold seeps that emerge through fractures in the bottom of the trenches. Around those filtration points, ecosystems develop that, like those of hydrothermal vents, do not depend on sunlight. ROVs have found in the cold seeps of the Mariana Trench and the Japan Trench communities of mussels, clams, and tube worms fed by chemosynthetic bacteria that metabolize the methane and hydrogen sulfide that emerge with the fluids. The exploration of ocean trenches has also produced findings with implications for the search for extraterrestrial life. The existence of complex ecosystems under conditions of extreme pressure, total darkness, temperatures near freezing point, and without access to solar energy has radically expanded the concept of habitability. If life can thrive at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, it could equally thrive in the subsurface oceans of moons such as Europa, of Jupiter, or Enceladus, of Saturn, where liquid water oceans are known to exist beneath a layer of ice. Astrobiologists from the NASA Astrobiology Institute explicitly cite the ecosystems of ocean trenches and hydrothermal vents as the most relevant terrestrial analogues for the possible habitable environments of the outer solar system. Today, the exploration of ocean trenches continues at a growing pace. The limiting factor of Triton submarines has made more than 200 descents to great depths since 2018. The Nereid Under Ice, ROV of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution has explored both ocean trenches and the bottom beneath the Arctic ice. The autonomous vehicle Orpheus, developed jointly by Woods Hole and NASA to prepare future missions to extraterrestrial oceans, completed its first deep immersion in the Puerto Rico Trench in 2021. Each descent brings new data, unknown organisms, undescribed geological processes. The bottom of the ocean trenches is not the inhospitable desert that was imagined. It is one of the most active, most diverse, and strangest ecosystems on the planet, and we have barely begun to know it. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.